You're watching The Ready Writer, a show where I get to speak to writers of all different genres, mediums, and experiences. The Ready Writer. Are you ready? It is time for another episode of The Ready Writer. I am your host, Casey Bell, and today's guest is Eliot Parker. Let's get started. What was your earliest memory of you discovering your writing talent?
You know, the very first time I ever realized that I had any kind of writing talent was back in eighth grade. And my eighth grade English teacher, Mr. Cyrus, uh, at the end of the year, we had done several types of writings. And he was an old school English teacher. You know, he taught us how to diagram sentences. We kept notebooks on diagramming sentences, which I think, first of all, really helped me learn how to write and how words work and the impact that words have in sentences. But at the end of the year, he presented me with a certificate. And I didn't know what the certificate was or what was going on, but it was the writing award, the school writing award for eighth grade. And it was something that really struck me and caught me by surprise. And he wrote me a very nice note, a handwritten note, inside of that folder with the certificate, encouraging me to keep writing. And he told me, he said, you know, you've got some talent and you really are going to be a good writer, and I hope you stay with it, and I wish you all the best. And unfortunately, I don't have the handwritten note, but I still have the certificate that I got in eighth grade. So that was probably the earliest memory I had, or the very first time that someone actually reached out to me that wasn't a friend or a family member and acknowledged that I was a good writer and that maybe I had some talent for writing.
Amazing. So when did you decide to go ahead and publish a book?
The very first book I wrote was called Breakdown at Clear River, and it came out in 2012. My previous writing experience had been primarily short stories, sending short stories off to literary journals and magazines. Some of those, most of those were still the print version, the online literary magazines and online places where you could submit creative work hadn't really come on the scene very much yet. And Twitter wasn't even around then, and Facebook was in its infancy. So it was very much still a mail it into the literary journal, literary magazine, and had the self-addressed stamped envelope to get a reply. But it was after I had done several short stories and had them published that I thought, you know, I'd really like to take on the challenge of writing a novel. And so I sat down and worked on it for about a year and a half, somewhere between a year and a half and 2 years. I had a lot of stops and starts and wondering if I was heading in the right direction. And then I had a former friend of mine, well, I shouldn't say a former friend, a friend who I didn't see very often anymore. He reached out to me. I was telling him I was writing a novel, and he said, you know, here's something to keep in mind as you're writing a novel, Elliot. He said, a novel is basically just a series of short stories around one character and around one or set of characters and around one theme. So that got me thinking about writing a novel as a set of short stories or short scenes or short episodes around a central character, a central plot, and a central storyline. So that's when I started really focusing on novel writing. And I've kind of made a shift. I write mostly novels now, but I still dabble in short stories. But it was really understanding and writing and getting the short stories published that kind of led me down the path to writing a novel.
When did you first decide to start submitting your work to journals, and how did you get the knowledge to do that?
The very first literary journal I submitted to was a journal called Spec, which was at, or still is at, Mary Washington College in Virginia. And is when I was an undergraduate student. I went to Marshall University. I had a good friend of mine named Zach, who was an English major, and he had started a creative writing club on campus, and he asked me to join. I was a journalism major as an undergraduate student, and so I told Zach, I said, I don't really know if this is the kind of, I don't do this kind of writing. I don't really know if I'm the kind of person you want to be in your club. And he said, look, Elliot, I've got to have enough people as members if we're going to get sanctioned as a charter club on campus. And I was like, okay. So anyway, I was in that club for 2 years. And our senior year, all of us that were in the club made a agreement or agreed that by the end of the year, we would send something out for submission. And we had people in the club. Some were poetry writers, some were screenwriters, some were fiction, some were nonfiction, some were memoir. And so we all agreed to submit something by the end of the year. And I had worked on a ghost story that I'd been working on, that I'd wanted to write for a long time, and kind of been percolating in my mind for a while. And so I wrote that story. We workshopped it as a group and made revisions and brought those revisions back and workshopped them again. And so by the end of that year, and of course this is back before Submittable and all these other electronic submission platforms were out. So we actually had to go to the post office, get an envelope, mail it out. And then that literary journal Spec at Mary Washington College published it. And that was really the first time I actually had a literary journal publish something that I had written. And this was probably in 2010 or 11 when that journal was published. And so I was in graduate school at the time, and that's when it finally got accepted. I had submitted it and didn't hear anything back for a long time. And something had happened there with the journal. They had changed editors or something, or there was some discussion about the journal maybe not continuing. So there was a gap between the time I submitted and the time that it got published. So I had moved on to graduate school by then, but still it was a really nice opportunity to have that published. And that was the first time I really had a short story published in some kind of a journal or magazine.
Would you say during your process you received more rejections than acceptance, or a little bit of both?
Definitely more rejections than acceptance, but I know every author looks at rejections differently, and I know a lot of the authors that you've had on your program view those differently, but I see a lot of value in the rejections. I think you have to realize as a writer that it's not personal when you get a rejection. It has nothing to do with necessarily your work or your story or your theme or you personally. Sometimes it's just a matter of timing. Sometimes it's just a matter of fit. Sometimes it's just a matter of, has that literary journal or magazine published a number of stories similar to yours or in that same genre, and maybe they're not looking to put that in this particular issue or edition of the magazine. But one of the things I really enjoy about getting those is if an editor takes time to give you feedback, specific feedback on what either he or she really liked about your piece or what he or she really thought needed improvement, that to me is all the value and makes a rejection worthwhile. Now, you don't get those a lot of times because those take time for an editor to respond and write out and give back to you. But I'm always looking for those rejections. When I do get rejections, did I get any feedback so that I can make this piece better for the next time that I go out and look to submit it somewhere? So yeah, definitely more rejections than acceptance letters early on. Still get plenty of rejections even today, but I really glean a lot from the feedback. If an editor takes time to give me some feedback, I really value that. I read that and I pay attention to it. And as I'm making revisions and corrections to the work, then I take those considerations and those suggestions into account.
Well, I think it's great that they actually gave you feedback. I can't say I've ever received feedback from a rejection myself. So talk about Snapshots, your latest book. What is it about? What inspired it?
Sure. This is a copy of the book right here, Snapshots, a collection of short stories. It came out in May of 2020 by Morgan James Publishing. And it was by far the absolute worst time probably in the history of publishing to have a book come out, because we were right in the middle of the pandemic, and we weren't sure, both writers and publishers and bookstores and online retailers weren't sure what the rest of the year was going to look like in terms of getting work out to an audience. So it was a terrible time to come out with a book, but I'm really pleased with it. And this is a collection of short stories that I've been working on since I started that very first short story I was telling you about that got submitted to Mary Washington College. I started working on short stories off and on. Sometimes I would work on them in between novels that I was writing. Sometimes I would work on them if I was working on a novel and I had written my character into a corner and couldn't get him out of a corner, or wrote them into a situation that I couldn't get out of, I'd step away from that and work on short stories. So it's taken me about 10 years to get this collection of stories together. It's a multi-genre collection of stories. So there's some mystery and thriller in here. There is some romance. There is some speculative fiction. There is some family drama. There's a little bit of everything in this collection. But these stories are set in Appalachia, in primarily 3 states, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. And I picked those states because I've either lived there, I'm from West Virginia originally, I got my MFA at Eastern Kentucky University and my doctorate in English at Murray State. So I spent a lot of time going to school in Kentucky, and I've lived in Southern Ohio as well over the course of my life. So I centered those stories in those three areas because I've been there, either as a person or a student or just an ordinary citizen. But basically what happens in those three states and some of the small towns and larger cities in this collection is that the kind of the theme that unites these stories together is there's decisions and choices that all of the main characters in each of these stories make. And these decisions that they make are going to alter the expectations and circumstances that they're going to be facing going forward. So the idea of snapshots, and the idea of a snapshot is that there's one moment in all of these stories where a character kind of has to sort of freeze for a moment and examine who they are, what they're doing, what they're getting ready to do, or what they're getting ready not to do, and how that is going to alter the circumstances that they find themselves in. So it's like it's like taking a snapshot and looking at a snapshot Polaroid. And I also got the idea for the title from a quote by an author that I really like, Eudora Welty, and she had a quote one time that said, "A good snapshot stops a moment from going away." And so that was another theme that I liked, or a quote that I liked to come up with the theme for this collection of stories. And Snapshots is actually one of the stories. There's a story titled Snapshots in this collection. But all of these characters have to sort of face and make a decision. Are they going to continue to do what they've been doing that has got them into the problems or the situation that they're in, or are they going to reverse course and take another path? And if they do that, what's that going to do to them, the people that are involved in their lives? And so that's really kind of the theme that connects these 11 stories. But again, they're all multi-genre. So there's a different kind of story in there for every reading taste that someone might have.
I like that concept, the title, and the fact that you have a different genre for each short story. So today, there's a lot more options in publishing a book, and it's not easy, but it's much easier than it was in the past. But you said you published your first novel prior to all these options. So did you receive help, or did you go in blindly with the publishing process and figured it out, or did you research study? How did your very first book publishing process go for you?
Sure. When Breakdown at Clear River came out in 2012, I believe it was, it came out from a small Appalachian press called Mid-Atlantic Highlands Publishing. I had met the executive director of that publishing operation at a writing workshop that was held in Charleston, West Virginia, a year or two, probably, it might have been 2010 when we first met. And his name was Patrick Grace, and he and I were having lunch during the workshop, and we were just talking about work, and we were talking about, and I said, I'm working on this story, and I kind of explained to him what it was about, and set in West Virginia and all of that. And he said, well, hey, I'd really like to take a look at it. And I thought he was just humoring me and being nice to me, because here I was, this novice newbie writer that only had some short stories under his belt and had never written a novel before. But he followed up with me, expressed some interest in the book, and so I sent it to him. And so over the course of about a year and a half, 2 years, we worked on revisions and editing and getting it up to shape and making it the best book that it could be. It was nominated for a Weatherford Award in 2012 for Best Appalachian Fiction, which I was really honored to receive that. But to kind of answer your question more specifically, talking with him about how the publishing process worked was helpful. He had a long career in publishing. He had worked as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. He was stationed in Rome and in Germany and in France for a long time. He'd worked in Chicago working for some university presses and other publishing outfits. So he had a long career in publishing. So I learned a lot from that. And then I just kind of educated myself. I started, following publishing companies online, started following their Facebook feeds. I started going to workshops when I could, both writing workshops and workshops where authors and publishers were present to kind of figure out kind of how this whole publishing process works. And I also started looking at, there is still a book. It's a big, thick yellow book, and it's the Marketplace Guide to Publishing. And it comes out every year. You can get it either online or at your local public library. And it's got a list of all the publishers and all the agents that are currently in business for that current year. So you can go through and look at publishers, and it's broken down by publishers that are looking for certain types of work. So there's a section for thriller publishers, for example, which is what I do. I write mostly thriller stories, thriller novels. And mystery and suspense. And so there's a section in that guidebook for that. So I use that to kind of find out, okay, how many publishers really are out here? Where are they located? How many are small? How many are in the big five, or what we consider the big five, like Simon and Schuster and HarperCollins and all of that. So a little bit, so some of it was Patrick's tutelage, but some of it was me just kind of educating myself, because I figured if I was going to be an author and I was going to be submitting my work into this marketplace, I needed to learn and understand how this marketplace works and kind of what the process is like when I submit something somewhere. Where does it go? What happens to it? Who looks at it? What's the timeline? What's the process if you get accepted? What do you do if it gets rejected? All of those things. And so it was a little self-discovery, but Patrick was a lot of help as well in kind of educating me on some of the behind-the-scenes things of publishing.
Awesome. And just for the record, for those watching, that book he was referring to, the Writer's Publishing Guide, you can actually get a copy from your library. Obviously, you can't keep it and you can't write in it, but I do remember getting one of those years ago and just going through it. It's not just, agents and publishing. They even have, if you want to write for greeting cards, if you want to write for, plays. And so it's a thick book to go through, but it shows you all your opportunities as a writer. And it's definitely a great start for those starting out. So you said you published this new book, Snapshots, with a publishing company, independent publishing company, and you both knew that you were producing this book during the pandemic. So was there some type of meeting you had to decide how you were going to market it? Because obviously all of the normal book signings, book expos, book festivals obviously was not going to be happening. Did you guys discuss what you would be doing differently to market the book, being that you didn't have all the regular ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did. We had several conversations over that, and I have to, give so many compliments and my hats off to the staff at Morgan James, because they had given me some ideas that I hadn't even considered in terms of ways to reach readers during the pandemic. So, typically a book like this, you would see, at a bookstore, it would be on the shelf facing outward. If it were in a regular bookstore during the pandemic, it might be in the regional or local author section, depending on the bookstore, but you'd be able to grab it, feel it, touch it, and hold on to it. And as you said, Casey, so many of those outlets were gone during the pandemic. So one of the things that we did is we hit up podcasts pretty heavily. I was on several podcasts throughout the country to talk about the book. One of the things that Morgan James did almost immediately when we signed the contract for publication was get the ebook ready, get the ebook out there and available, so that folks, as they were hearing about the book and couldn't get to a bookstore, or for whatever reason couldn't get to the library to download it onto their reading device, could at least have the ebook, and then they followed up very quickly with the printed option after that. So they really kind of pushed the book forward, I think, a little faster on their timeline, on their publishing schedule, maybe than normal. I wasn't the only author they did that for. They did it for several of us that were kind of in that late winter, early spring publishing situation where the pandemic was going on. So we did podcasts quite a bit. We did a lot of social media marketing through Facebook, through Twitter, through Instagram, and I was surprised at looking at those myself. I was surprised at how cheap those options are for an author. If I was going at it alone, I would certainly look at that, and I would encourage folks to look at that. If you're a self-published author, you're doing this on your own, or if your publisher is not committing enough resources or a lot of resources to marketing, look at those ads that you run. They're highly effective and very inexpensive. So we did the social media marketing. We submitted the book to several award contests that were going on. I'm pleased to say that Snapshots won the 2020 Pencraft Literary Award for Short Story Anthology, and it won the 2021 Feathered Quill Book Award for Short Story Anthology. And so one of the ways that helped in marketing is once the book won an award, the the organization that awarded the book those honors created a press kit. They contacted newspapers and television stations, both in their region and in the region in which I live and where I've worked. And so that was another way that we got the word out. So there were press releases that were run in newspapers where I grew up. There were press releases run on TV news websites, TV channel websites. So we used a lot of those methods to get the word out, to let people know that the book is here, it's available, here's what it's about, here's how you can get a copy of it. So we did a lot of sort of cyber marketing, and we probably would have done some of that, and they mentioned this to me, we would have done quite a bit of that under normal circumstances, but we would have supplemented that cyber marketing with, book signings and speaking engagements and workshops and those kinds of things where you can meet people face to face. And so it went really well. It went better than I expected. I was a little reticent at first, thinking, is this really going to work? But it went really well. And so my hat's off to Morgan James. I mean, they came up with a plan and a blueprint for how it was going to work, and it went really, really well. And so one of the things I learned, Casey, from that experience and that process is there is an audience out there for your work. And there are people that will read your work and want to read your work. You just got to find a way to get their attention and to let them know that your work is out there. And you've got to do it in a way that fits your personality and your style, but also your budget. Again, if you're doing it alone. But this notion that, we have 35,000 romance novels out there, nobody wants to read another one is not true. Or we have 35,000 mystery stories out there, nobody wants to read another one. No, there's an audience out there. It's just a matter of getting their attention and letting them know that your work is there. And so I feel like the cyber marketing aspect of it was a way that I hadn't had a whole lot of experience with in the past that worked really well.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things we also have to remember is, as horrible as this pandemic is, as far as all of the deaths and all of the political problems we've been having, nothing new ever comes to life until there is problems. And so it's bad, but it forces us to come up with new ideas to do things, such as all the webinars I've been watching and all of the virtual book signings and things of that nature. Even now, celebrities are realizing that even after the pandemic, I still don't have to fly to another state to do a TV show. I can just appear at my home. Why do all of that back and forth when you can just do it at home? So I think it kind of, it opens us up to new ideas. And then hopefully when things get back to, I don't want to say normal, because in my opinion, America's normal was not good. So I hope it allows us to not be so stuck on, okay, this is the only way we can do a book signing. This is the only way we can do a book expo. This is the only way. It kind of opens up our idea to do more than just what we've been doing. So even though this just came out this came out a year ago, right? So are you stuck on this, or are you working on another project?
I am. I'm still stuck on this. I'm still getting, emails from readers and comments from readers and Facebook messages from readers who are still discovering the book, which is a wonderful thing. I think you talk about sort of a new normal that is existing in literature. I think there is an appetite for short stories and short story collections that, weren't there 10 years ago. I mean, I can remember 10 or 12 years ago talking to some publishers and going to writing conferences, listening to agents talk, and they said, oh, no, the short story collections won't sell. They won't sell. Well, here we are 10, 12 years later, and they do sell. And, I have friends that live in Washington, D.C. I have friends that live in major cities that have to ride the subway trains to work. And that's where they get their pleasure reading done, when they're sitting on the train for an hour and 15 minutes. And a short story collection is great because you can read one whole story, get one complete story on your way to work if you're riding the metro in DC, and you can get another story on the metro on your way back. And so I think we're seeing, and when you do go back to your local bookstore or a chain bookstore, notice how many short story collections you see appearing on the outward facing shelves right as you come through the front door. They're increasing in number. And I think part of that is our attention spans are changing. Social media is changing the way we get content, and we want content in small, short bites. So I think there's a real appetite for short stories. And if you're thinking about writing short stories, or you've got a short story collection that you're putting together, in my opinion, in my experience with Snapshots, has been there is a wide reservoir of readers out there, more so than maybe we've ever had. So I think for that reason, Snapshots is still resonating, even though it has been out for a year. But I am working on a new thriller. Well, I have a new thriller out. It'll be out in October of this year, October 2021. It's called A Final Call. It is a sequel to another thriller that came out in 2017 called Code for Murder. It's set in Cleveland, Ohio, and it features a female homicide detective named Stacey Tabbitt. So that book got delayed a little bit also because of the pandemic. It kind of got pushed back a little bit on the publication schedule, but it will be out later this late October, around Halloween time of 2021. And then I'm also working on another sequel to my book, A Knife's Edge, which was an Amazon bestseller in 2018 in thriller writing. The sequel to that is called Double Crossed. And so I'm working on that right now. And that features a gay police detective, police sergeant in Charleston, West Virginia, where I'm from and where I grew up. His name's Ronan McCullough. And so I've got kind of two series going right now, one with a female detective, homicide investigator, the other with a male homicide detective. And so I'm kind of in different stages with both of those. With the second book in the Stacey Tabbitt series will be out in October. And then I'm hoping that to have the sequel to A Knife's Edge with Ronan out finished by the end of this year. Have the first draft finished by the end of this year. So things are happening. I'm still working on some short stories. I had a short story called The Bank, which was just accepted for publication in Black Moon magazine for their April edition. So I'm still tinkering and having fun with short stories as well. So yeah, a lot going on, staying busy.
Well, I like that you're still submitting. You didn't stop your submission. Cool. So my last question for you, if during your time of reading, if there's an author out there that you would like to meet, whether they be dead or alive, whether they be known or unknown, who would this author be and how have they inspired you?
Oh, that's a great question. Can I have two? Not to change the question. Okay, great. I didn't want to skirt around your question or change the parameters of it. There are two writers that have had tremendous influence on me. From a classical perspective, it's John Steinbeck. I fell in love with John Steinbeck when I was a junior in high school, and we read The Grapes of Wrath, which is a story I had never read before. And then my senior year of high school in English, we read East of Eden by Steinbeck, which I think is his best book. He's got all of his books are wonderful, Of Mice and Men and Travels with Charlie and The Grapes of Wrath, of course. But I think East of Eden is probably his most ambitious and magnificent work. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's basically his version or his retelling of the Cain and Abel story from the Bible. And it's just wonderfully written. The language is just sumptuous. He is so good and was so good at understanding the human condition and understanding people. And he wrote bad guys that you loved to hate, but at the same time, you kind of rooted for. I mean, you kind of understood why they acted the way that they did. And he was the first writer I came across, a classical writer that really did that where it resonated with me. And the way he writes scenery and setting is just amazing. He had such a passionate love for the Salinas Valley, which is where he is from and where he lived a good big portion of his life. And East of Eden is set there, and Of Mice and Men is set kind of in a camp close to there. And Grapes of Wrath, the Job family migrates from the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma in the 30s out to the Salinas Valley. So, you know, he almost writes the Salinas Valley and describes the Salinas Valley like we might see heaven in the afterlife. And so he was a huge influence on me. And I love the way that he made bad guys that could be so cruel and so mean and evil, but at the same time, were human, and you could kind of understand. You didn't maybe agree with it, but you could understand why they acted the way they did and behaved the way that they did. The other author that really had a huge impact on me was Pat Conroy, and he died just a few years ago of pancreatic cancer. But like Steinbeck, he wrote about a certain part of the country, that kind of the low South, or Beaufort, South Carolina, and the Bywater territories down there. Those were kind of the settings for a lot of his stories. But again, just wonderful writing. I mean, I could read a paragraph of Conroy's writing and just get lost in the words and the language and the way that he can put sentences together. And like Steinbeck, his understanding of the human condition and conflict and what makes people drawn to one another and what makes people not like one another was unlike anybody I had read, from a more contemporary perspective. And I'm so sad now, because now that he's gone, I used to always look forward to a new novel from him. His books usually came out every September or October, and I've missed those. But he was a wonderful writer, and someone that I really aspire to. And I find myself, Casey, going back to those two writers, even though I've read everything that both those authors have written. I've read Steinbeck and Conroy's books 2 and 3 times each. I still find myself going back there for inspiration, or going back to see, now, how did Steinbeck handle that difficult conversation between his protagonist and his antagonist, or how did Conroy explain the emotional toll this character was having after this certain circumstance happened, or whatever it might be. So I go back to those texts often when I need inspiration, or I want to think about how they handled a certain writing problem that I might be dealing with. So John Steinbeck and Pat Conroy, two writers I wish I had a chance to talk to and meet, and I wish they were still alive today.
Thank you, Eliot Parker, for stopping on by The Ready Writer. I thank you so much for sharing your journey and your story with us. And to you, the audience, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Have a great week.